Tribe disbanded, Newport, Rhode Island, summer of '98, age 18. Before I knew it, I was back on Cheyenne. I flew into Charleston, South Carolina, because I was convinced that my family needed help taking the boat north. I'd enjoyed myself in Wisconsin, but waking up in a strange bed that far away from the ocean had made me dizzy. I'd wandered outside and hadn't been able to tell which way was south. I sat on the rocks beside Lake Michigan with Michelle and Zach, talking about how we wanted to see the world before we were too old. Zach took me for a ride on his motorcycle, and we flew into Milwaukee at 120 miles per hour, Michelle falling behind us in the LeBaron. I thought I was going to die. I didn't talk to my dad when I got home, and none of us said much of anything. It felt like coming home after Baltimore when I'd gone to see Cole, except this time I'd been gone longer. The trip up the East Coast to Newport was hot and monotonous, and we dropped the anchor off Ida Lewis Yacht Club in early June. Michelle drove out a few days after we got there. Newport was ripe with tourists, and Michelle and I made good tips when we worked together. On foggy days, I sat out on Adirondack's bow, looking for other boats and buoys and land, while Michelle relayed messages to the captain. I never thought, while I was watching shadows and silhouette sailboats coast through the fog, that I would be the first to fall off or be crushed if Adirondack hit anything. Michelle moved into an apartment on Ann Street. It was right in the middle of downtown Newport, a block uphill from Thames Street. It was small and old, and the kitchen had a crooked floor. When I was there, I slept on a mattress in the living room. The rest of the time I stayed aboard Cheyenne, drifting back and forth between land and sea. The first boat we looked at was a Seafarer 31. It was sitting in someone's backyard, just over the state line in Connecticut, and looked like it had been sitting for years. Michelle and I drove out in the LeBaron and met with the owner in the back of a machine shop. He showed us the sails, clean and spread out across the parking lot, ready for our inspection, and drove over to the boat with us following. I don't think he's taking us seriously, I said, as we took a sharp turn down a tree-lined street. Well, that's his problem, isn't it? Michelle's oversized Calvin Klein sunglasses slid down her nose. We parked behind the owner's truck in an overgrown lot with several rotted cars sitting on blocks placed at odd positions around the perimeter. The boat was in the middle, mast off, sitting proud and full-keeled on jack stands. Her hull was streaked green with mildew. Well, here she is, the owner said. I'll let you ladies take your time looking. He threw the key to Michelle. Thanks, she said. Is there a ladder? Oh, sure. He pointed to an aluminum ladder propped against one of the cars. Use that one. I'm going to go back to the shop, so just bring the key on back when you're done. Okay, Michelle struck out for the ladder, and I walked around the hull looking for the telltale lumps that would show blistering or delamination. I knew that if fiberglass isn't laid up properly, the polyester resin separates from the glass and forms weak patches in the hull. The Seafarer's hull looked solid. I stepped back and admired the slender stern overhang and thought about how pretty she would look in the water. Michelle planted the ladder against the stern and climbed into the cockpit. This boat needs a lot of cleaning, she said. We can handle that. I followed her up the ladder. Inside the boat was bare and tiny, with a V-berth that didn't look like it was big enough for one person, let alone two. There was a small alcohol stove in the galley, a fold-down table, and an unfinished head. The sacrifice of space for lines was obvious. On a boat with delicate overhangs like this one had, most of the length was wasted. We spent the afternoon crawling around the boat, even though we both knew it wasn't the right one. We spent more afternoons over the next few weeks looking at other boats, Ericsson's and Catalina's, Morgan's and Pearson's, anything over 20 years old and under 10 grand. Nothing seemed to fit. It's like we're looking at all the wrong boats, Michelle said. We were standing on the bow of Adirondack with Tim coming in from an evening sail. The tourists were seated in the cockpit, drinking champagne and beer, basking in the summer air and the scenery. "You'll know when you find the right one," Tim said. The warmth of his presence and the comfort I had knowing that he was part of my tribe washed over me as I opened a cold beer from the cooler. I didn't drink during the days while I was working, but the owners of Adirondack didn't mind if I swiped a beer or two in the evenings. Tim and Michelle and Cole were ocean people who couldn't live without the feeling of water moving under the hull of a well-chosen and well-loved sailboat. We understood each other, and when I looked at Michelle's face, tilted into the sunset, and her eyes half closed, the lines around her mouth rippling into a smile, and Tim's smile surging against his skin in the same way, I felt like I was home. Tim's eyes were fixed on me. "Don't you think you just need to spend some more time looking?" he asked. Sometimes his voice wavered when he asked questions like this, as if by my getting a boat and living out my dream, it would somehow make up for the fact that he hadn't yet. "You're right." I rubbed a fingerprint off Adirondack's varnish with the hem of my shirt. "We won't be able to look at anything next week, because I'll be in the Bahamas on that stupid charter with my parents. We were going to lead a group of charter boats around the Abacos the next week. Dad had been hired by the charter company to teach sailing and cruising seminars on a week-long sail. We, his family, were part of the package." "Oh, you'll have fun," Michelle said. "No, I won't," I said. "We are going to be sailing on a Clorox bottle." "Oh," Michelle wrinkled her nose, and I noticed a few lines on her face that were deeper than they should have been. "I take it you'll never be buying a brand new boat," Tim said. We laughed. Ever since Cole and his dad had delivered one of the mass-produced new breed of fiberglass sailboat from the Abacos to Maryland the previous winter, surviving a near dismasting when two of the shrouds broke in heavy weather, I thought of most newer models as fiberglass death traps. Clorox bottle was a term we used to refer to any of these vessels. I jumped onto the dock of Adirondack, slid into her slip. It was my favorite part of the daily sailing trips, taking that flying leap from as far out as I dared, watching the gap between boat and concrete dock narrow under my feet. If I missed, I would be crushed between them. I never missed. My knees bent to absorb the shock, and I hit the dock, running to catch the spring line that Michelle threw to me. The tourists gasped, delightfully aware of the risk I was taking. They started digging in their pockets and purses for tip money. Tim stood back and grinned. My family spent a week leading starry-eyed sailors around, teaching them how to navigate the Bahamian shallows and how to move aboard and raise a family if, of course, they were willing to make the sacrifices. Standing on the pier one evening, surrounded by wide-eyed future liveaboards, I pounded a hole in the whorls of a queen conch that we had collected. I used one of the cheap steak knives we'd found aboard the charter boat to reach in and cut the muscle, feeling the creature go slack against my thumb, which was jammed up inside the lip. I grabbed the upper column and pulled the conch out, holding it up for the group to see. "Now you have to cut its head off," I said. "That makes it less slimy." I picked up a sharper fillet knife and slivered through the meat, just under the protruding eyes. The chunk of meat fell to the pier and I nudged it away with a toe. "Good bait if anyone wants it," I said. The group watched as I skinned the creature and trimmed its orange mantle back, and in the final act of cutting off the upper column, I waved the fillet knife with a flare. "Who's next? I'll walk you through it," I said, holding up another conch that needed cleaning, but nobody in the group wanted to give it a try. It was cocktail hour, and they were drifting off to the marina bar. Not a bad idea, I thought as I rushed through the remaining conch. The act of killing for food was something that was so natural to me. I never stopped to think about the fact that I was destroying a living creature as I pounded holes through the shells and severed the lifeline between snell and shell with my knife. Once finished, I washed the slime from my hands and headed to the bar. I ordered Bacardi and Diet Cola and closed my eyes as I felt the sweet rum slide down the back of my throat. I was old enough to drink legally in the Bahamas, where the drinking age was 18, but it didn't really matter since Bahamian bartenders were famous for giving American girls of any age whatever they wanted from the bar. I joined Carolyn off to the side of the bar, and we drank together in silence, watching the crowd get rowdy. Our parents drank and moved from table to table, socializing and selling the dream. We flew back to Rhode Island when the trip was over, tanned and tired, and piled into Michelle's LeBaron, 3 of us in the back and Dad and Michelle up front. Once we'd cleared the airport traffic, Michelle started talking. I was sitting right behind her, so I watched the back of her head. "I've been talking to some people about what to do this winter," she said. "Most of the crew here head down to the Virgin Islands. I guess it's really easy to find work down there, and you can make a lot of money." I was having trouble hearing her in the back seat. Carolyn was squeezed in beside me, and her elbow poked my ribs when I tried to lean forward. "You know, most of those jobs sound a lot more glamorous than they really are," Dad said, always a cynic. "All you'd be doing is cleaning up puke after the tourists get seasick." "That's what we do now on Adirondack, Dad," I said. I wanted him to be quiet so I could listen to Michelle. Her voice stayed flat and level as she spoke. "Zach is coming out here in a couple of weeks," she said. "I think he's going to stay for the summer." I couldn't imagine Zach wanting to move onto a small sailboat with us for the trip south. No, for good. I think we're going to try to find a boat that we can help deliver to St. Thomas. What, as crew? Yeah. Then we've talked about living down there and trying to save some money. Michelle rolled down her window and let the wet Rhode Island air into the car. It smelled like it had blown across miles of tangled seaweed. "I thought the 2 of you were going to get a boat," Carolyn said. I thought so too. I may have spoken, or I may have just thought the words, but nobody responded. Michelle was quiet until she dropped us off at the dinghy dock. Chenoo rested at anchor out in the harbor, floating in a layer of fog. As I watched the fog become so thick that the boat disappeared and then reappeared only to fade again, as if it was some sort of ghost. New England fog is cold and wet, and it hit my bones with a chill that was just as otherworldly as the ghost-like appearance of Chenoo. I thought so too. My mouth was dry, even though the air was so moist, and I tried to make sense of this new information that I had been given. I told Michelle I'd see her tomorrow at work, and went to the boat with my family. Riding through the fog in the dinghy, I wondered what had just happened and what was next. At the end of the summer, I had turned 19 and upgraded my captain's license to a 50-ton master's simply because I could. I'd looked through every boat trader magazine that came out, saved up a little more money, and applied to another college. A family friend told me about Eckerd College, a small private school in southwest Florida that was located right on the water. I filled out the paperwork without giving it a second thought. I made a little bit of progress in my yacht design classes, but didn't think about them much either. Zach took Michelle away as soon as he got there. He swore he'd learned to sail so he got a job on one of the 12-meter boats, an old America's Cup contender. I saw less and less of them. Cole came to visit. "Why don't you just start looking for your own boat?" he said. "You are perfectly capable of doing it by yourself." We shared a lobster dinner at one of the wharf-side restaurants for my 19th birthday. We'd both dressed up to the point where we felt uncomfortable. Earlier that day, we'd rented a moped and flown across the streets of Newport like happy tourists. I guess I said I haven't really decided what I'm going to do. "Well, you know, you can't stay on that boat with your parents." Cole dipped a plump piece of lobster into melted butter, and I watched a trail of it glisten on his chin while he talked. "I know you love the boat, but aren't they trying to sell it?" "Yeah, they're talking about it." "Well, you could always move in with me. We can head south for the winter, maybe even all the way down to the Virgins." Cole leaned over the table and held my hand between both of his. His fingers were thick and short, and his knuckles were scarred from working on boats. I loved his hands and loved what he stood for, but was beginning to realize that I didn't love him enough to make the sacrifices that being with him required. I was beginning to realize that I would not be satisfied settling for a life of casual drifting, as appealing as that life seemed to be. Moving in with him would be temporary, and temporary wasn't what he wanted. Later that night I told him that things would never work between us. I had no idea what my plans were, but I was determined to figure them out and carry them through on my own. We broke up that night for the first time in a series of small breakups and heartbreaks that lasted about 6 months. When it was all said and done, and we'd asked each other for that final release of "Do not contact me again," I couldn't help wondering which one of us had been taken advantage of more. At the beginning of September, I drove Tim back to the shore in the dinghy after he'd eaten dinner aboard Chenu. The moon was full, hanging over Newport harbor like a paper lantern. It left a trail of silver on the water, the trail parting only for the silhouettes of the sloops and yawls that hadn't been hauled out for the season yet. "What do you think of that moon?" Tim leaned back, his hands clasped around his knees. "Beautiful," I said. I wanted to cut the outboard motor off and row, so we wouldn't wreck the peace and quiet, and so I could make the short trip take as long as possible. "Melanie, I have something to tell you," Tim said. "Nobody else knows yet, but I want to tell you." He unclasped his hands and leaned forward. "I'm going to be a dad," he said. "Oh wow." I gripped the handle on the outboard so tight I could feel the bones in my hand rattle. Time slowed down, and his words hung suspended in the night air. This wasn't what I expected. Maybe I thought he was about to tell me he was getting a boat and taking off, finally getting away from Newport and the dreary office at Cruising World. Deep in my stomach, and only for a moment, I felt a small flutter of hope that he was going to ask me to come with him. I would not have gone with Cole, but I would have gone with Tim. "Marina just told me she's pregnant," he said. He'd been seeing a woman in Boston named Marina for a while, but I hadn't thought it was that serious. She didn't seem interested in sailing. I didn't know much about her. I hadn't tried to learn much about her. I wondered how someone like Tim could make it work with a woman who wasn't interested in sailing. "Were you trying?" "No, but I guess it just happened anyway." He stared at a Hinckley yawl that slipped past us. "Well, congratulations." I didn't know what else to say. I knew that things couldn't stay the way they were forever. In all likelihood, this was my last summer in Newport, and while I was good at keeping in touch with people, it now felt like Tim was just as lost to me as the rest of my tribe. "I'm also getting a boat," Tim said. "A Vineyard Vixen. It's a gorgeous little double-ender, about 20 years old. I just want to have something I can take for day sails around the bay," he said. "You're not going to have much time for sailing with a baby," I said. "I know, but wait until you see it. It's a sweet boat. I'm picking it up next weekend, and how great will it be to teach the baby how to sail? What are you going to name the boat?" "Ave Marina," he said. I dropped him off at the wharf and hugged him good night. As I backed the dinghy out into the harbor, a black cormorant shook its head and dove off a piling, ducking underwater. I wondered how I'd managed to say goodbye to the 3 people I cared about the most all in one summer. Dodge Shadow, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, winter of '99, age 19. In Annapolis, I made an offer on a Seafarer 27. The broker accepted it, and I backed out, saying that the boat needed too much work. It really didn't, but something wasn't right. A few weeks later, I flew to Fort Lauderdale to help my dad deliver the new Chenoo to Wilmington, North Carolina, where we would meet up with the old Chenoo and move everything from one boat to the other. The new Chenoo was a Gulf Star 53 motor sailor. It was big and bulky and had a shallow draft and 3 staterooms. I didn't understand why my parents liked it so much. It didn't sail as well as the old Chenoo. It wasn't as seaworthy. It wasn't as pretty. On New Year's Day of '99, the same day the rest of my family moved onto the new Chenoo, I packed most of my stuff and took a taxi to the airport at Wilmington. I didn't know what I was going to end up doing, but I knew I had to leave. I'd picked the only place that felt remotely like home and booked a one-way flight to Fort Lauderdale. Carolyn didn't ask me why I was leaving, and I didn't try to tell her. I didn't really know why, except that it was time. Mom and Dad and Carolyn followed me up to the gate of Wilmington Marine Center, and none of us said anything when I got into a taxi. Mom cried, and Dad gave me $50. In Fort Lauderdale, it was 60 degrees warmer. A boating friend who I'd met in the Bahamas a few years before picked me up and took me back to the sailboat that she and her sister were living aboard. It was an Endeavour named Neverland. I got a job as a cashier in a nautical bookstore and worked in a restaurant at night. I was a terrible waitress and quit before they fired me. I had a driver's license, but I didn't have a car, so I bought a bicycle and rode it everywhere. My parents arrived in town aboard the new Chenoo and anchored in Lake Sylvia for a few days. I found an ad in the paper for a used Dodge Shadow convertible for $3,500. I didn't know anything about cars, but in the small photo it looked a lot like Michelle's Chrysler LeBaron, and I'd liked the LeBaron. My dad and I drove in my parents' rental car to a house in Pembroke Pines, located just off the Florida Turnpike, to negotiate a deal. "What do you know about the car?" Dad asked, as we searched for the street address. "Not much. Ice-cold air, about 80,000 miles on it, I guess." "That's a lot." Dad's hand gripped the wheel of the rental car. As comfortable as my dad was driving a boat, neither he nor my mom were the best automobile operators. He drove well below the speed limit and cursed the South Florida drivers. "I don't have enough money to buy anything newer." I flipped through the wad of bills in my purse. Earlier that day, I'd had my bank in Virginia wire me $3,000 cash was power when negotiating. This was something I'd learned from bartering for produce and trinkets with the Bahamian ladies at the straw markets in Nassau and Georgetown. "Well, let's check it out carefully," Dad said. Driving through the South Florida streets in the twilight, we shared a comfortable silence as we each made mental checklists of things to look at on the car. I had learned about engines because I knew I'd be buying a boat someday, and I knew it would come in handy, and I had learned about engines because I knew that it would make my dad proud of me. The seller had half a dozen used cars sitting in his front yard. The shadow was waxed and pretty, freshly sprayed with new car smell. I drove it around the block with my dad in the passenger seat. We couldn't find anything wrong with it, and the four-cylinder engine was incredibly simple and looked like it would be easy to work on. In the seller's living room, I pulled most of the cash out of my purse. "You're asking $3,500, but we discussed $3,000 on the phone," I said. "Well, yes, the car is in perfect condition," the seller said. "It also has a lot of miles on it." I moved the cash from one hand to the other. "You'll be driving along the beach with the top down," the seller said. "True, but I saw some of the stitching coming out of the vinyl." I said, "Look, I have cash, and I'm willing to pay $2,500. Will that work for you?" "How about $2,750? "Okay," I said. "Let's do it." My dad covered his mouth with his hand to hide the tiny smile that flashed across his face. I wondered if he could possibly be proud of me. There were so many things I had done to break his heart, but deep inside I felt like he might be starting to see me for what I was becoming, a scrappy and resourceful survivor type, just as stubborn as him. The seller signed the title over to me and gave me a temporary tag, and I took off in my new car, scared shitless. I wasn't much better of a driver than my parents. Jalous, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, winter and spring of '99, age 19. I rented a studio apartment in a triplex that was so close to I-95 that you could hear the sirens and horns and the general hum of traffic if you left the windows open. My salary from the bookstore barely covered the rent. The apartment came furnished with a twin bed and a hotel dresser and a plastic table and chairs. I covered the table with a dollar store tablecloth and bought brightly colored linens for the bed. The jalousie window over my bed opened to a bougainvillea, and small brown lizards jumped from the plant to the window and tried to slip inside. The neighborhood was mixed: white, black, Cuban, Haitian, gay party boys and straight ones, old folks, kids like me out on their own for the first time in a completely unsheltered and non-conventional environment. The woman who lived by herself next door to me claimed to be an aerobics instructor, but I was convinced she was a stripper. Michelle wrote me a few letters from St. Thomas, where she and Zach were living. They were crewing on tourist catamarans and saving money, just as they'd planned. Tim sent me a letter which was short and accompanied a book of mythology. He wrote something about a hero's journey that I didn't really understand. He was eloquent and poetic, and wrote that he was excited about being a father. Sitting on my twin bed with the window open and the bougainvillea scratching at the jalousie, I thought about writing him back and telling him I'd been a little bit in love with him, but that I was over it now. I decided against the lie. I dated a wiry redneck from the eastern shore of Maryland named Carey. He was 9 years older than me and loyal to a fault. He drove a privately owned sport fishing boat that was sometimes chartered out to wealthy Palm Beach folks to catch sailfish and marlin. On the days when he wasn't fishing, he maintained the boat and played rent-a-buddy to the owner, a millionaire from Maryland who liked to golf and bring his mistresses to the boat. Carrie and I had actually met in Wilmington, North Carolina, where his boat was being repaired at the same marina where we were moving everything from the old Chez Nous to the new Chez Nous. I had flirted with him out of boredom, but had started to like him when we went out to lunch, and he regaled me with stories of big game fishing. When I'd moved to Fort Lauderdale, I'd called him and told him that I'd make the big move and asked if he wanted to hang out. Carrie called me one day as I sat on my twin bed with Tim's card and book. "Hey," I said, holding my oversized Primeco cellular to my ear. I'd purchased it right after my move. I'd had to pay an exorbitant fee to get it set up, since I didn't have any credit established. "Hey, there's something I need to tell you," he said. "What?" "Well, I should have told you this before." His voice drifted off, and he took a deep breath. I pictured him drawing on his Marlboro and taking his glasses off as he wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. "What should you have told me?" "Well, I'm actually married," he said. "I have a wife up in Maryland and kids." "What the hell?" I slammed Tim's book down on the bed. There was silence on the other end, then a raucous laugh that got louder and louder until I had to hold the phone away from my head. "I'm fucking with you," he said. "I got you, didn't I?" He sucked in his breath and let it out, obviously pleased with himself. I guess you did," I said. "That's not really funny, though." "Yes, it is." He laughed some more, and I waited for him to finish. Later he would tell me that the joke had been his way of figuring out how to tell me he loved me. I told him that he had a pretty fucked up way of saying things. With with Carrie, I learned how to thread a long needle through live goggle eyes and twist a hook through the twine just the right way so that a sailfish would see the bait and not the hook. I learned how to fish with a kite, using it to lift the bait and carry it far, far away from the boat. I learned the names for the different brands of gold and silver reels that cost thousands and thousands of dollars. One night, Carrie and I drank with the chief of police of Palm Beach County, who knew I was 19 but didn't care. And with Carrie, I became a regular at the Singer Island and Palm Beach fishing bars. The boats would come into the marinas in the later afternoon, and the captains and crew would stumble off and find their way to a bar stool, where they talked about engines and chicks and fish, and passed small bags of Coke back and forth to each other in the bathrooms. Once I found a bag on the floor of the ladies' room at the Buccaneer Club, a small bar that was a favorite of ours. I ran out, terrified that just by seeing it I would be somehow guilty of partaking drugs. At this point, still scared me. Nothing good ever came out of them. Somewhere during the madness of my 19th year, my acceptance letter from Eckerd College came in the mail, along with offers of scholarships and information about room and board. Since I wasn't making much money at the bookstore, I decided that college would be a good idea. I called them and signed up for the fall semester. In April, Carrie convinced me to spend the summer with him in Ocean City, Maryland. Carrie's life was as seasonally inclined as my life had been. During the winter, he kept the boss's boat docked in Palm Beach, with the occasional trip over to the Bahamas. Summers, he took it up to Ocean City, where the fishing routine went from lighter tackle to the heavy gear used to catch tuna and white and blue marlins. "You can work cleaning boats," he said, as we drank margaritas at the Buccaneer Club. "Those girls clean up. You can charge $1 a foot, and if you clean 3 50-footers in one evening, you've made 150. All you have to do is wear a bikini and work it a little bit." He said, "Ha," I said, swirling the ice in my margarita. "I'm sure I don't have what those girls do. I didn't love my body. I was in pretty good shape, but my breasts were still small and my ass still large. Trust me, you'll be fine, and you don't really have to wear a bikini. The guys just want their boats cleaned," Carrie said. Later that month, Carolyn and I sat on the stern of a catamaran off Marina Cay in the British Virgin Islands. It was another charter expedition similar to the one we'd done in the Abacos the year before, except this time there were no conch cleaning demonstrations and no sessions on how to raise your kids aboard a boat. This time my dad was writing an article on how to plan a charter, so we'd been set up with a nice family vacation. tarpon schooled underneath our boat, and I had thrown in a fishing line to see if I could hook one. We passed a bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream back and forth, each swigging the syrupy liquid like nobody's business. Carolyn had become just as good a drinker as me. The mercurial tarpon grew darker as the sun set, and later that night the moonlight bounced off their scales. Such beautiful fish, I thought. Carrie had shown me how to reel in a sailfish as it danced across the water, its tail skimming the surface and its slick, muscled body glistening. Every fish had its own personality. The shadowy tarpon that circled below us were much more mysterious and ethereal. "So, are you thinking about college?" I passed the bottle to Carolyn, who downed the last of it. "Yeah, I'm not sure what else to do," she said. "There's good surf in Florida, and Flagler College in St. Augustine is a decent enough school." "Don't really know anything about it," I said. "Then you learning to surf?" "Yeah. Don't you remember I started last summer in Newport?" "Yes," she said. "Had I been too preoccupied to notice?" "Probably. Is someone teaching you?" "Guy named Scooter. He lives on a little sailboat, and we've been hanging out with him a lot. My parents and Carolyn had gone on to the Bahamas without me that winter, and they'd sailed to islands that they had never visited, while I was aboard places like Andros and Rum Cay. I was jealous that Carolyn was getting to see those places and I wasn't. For the charter, they'd left the new Cheyenne in the Exumas and flown to meet me in Miami, where we all took a plane to San Juan and then to Tortola." "What kind of name is Scooter?" I swirled my toe in the calm water over the tarpon. "I don't know, not his real name, I'm sure." Carolyn leaned back on the swim platform, empty bottle of Bailey's beside her. She had outgrown her awkwardness and become beautiful. She couldn't have been a model because she was short like Mom and I were, but she was thin and brown and had huge blue eyes and sun-streaked hair. "Sounds like a burnout," I said. "Yeah, he keeps following us, you know, showing up in the same places. Sketchy." We didn't catch a tarpon. We stumbled to our cabins, and the next morning I woke up and found my parents sitting out on the swim platform drinking coffee. The empty Bailey's bottle was gone, and the sun was already burning water droplets off the deck of the boat, leaving little specks of salt. I grabbed some coffee and went to sit with my parents. "So, did you set up everything with Eckerd College?" Dad asked. "Yep, I'm starting in August, international business." "International business? Where did that come from?" Mom squinted at me through the glare from the boat's white deck. "I figure that's the best way to make money, right?" I'd picked the major at random, thinking that it sounded like something a smart person would choose. "Good," Dad said. We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the water lapping on the twin hulls and drinking our coffee. "I guess Carolyn is thinking about college too," I said. "Yeah, we stopped in St. Augustine on the way down this year, so she could see Flagler." Mom bent over her coffee, peering into her cup as if to hide from the sun that she'd been staring into her whole life. She had fine lines around her eyes, and her skin was slackening around her jaw. My parents had been older than average when they had Carolyn and me, and now it was showing. "Good for her. Hey, I am going to go to Ocean City this summer," I said. "With that Carrie," Dad's face darkened. "Yeah, he says there's lots of money to be made detailing boats up there. It will be a good way to save for the school year." "I guess you're planning to live with him then." Dad's voice cracked the way it did when his anger was rising, and the vein in his neck started to throb. That anger, the same dark anger that I carried, that sometimes reared itself with sudden outburst or random acts of violence. I threw things or broke things, but only when nobody was looking. "It's not living with him," I said. "It's just for a couple of months." "Living with him for a couple of months then," Dad said. He and Mom looked at each other, and then we all looked out at the horizon, the rolling hills of Tortola and the slack water. Not far away in St. Thomas, Michelle and Zach were planning their return to the States with money saved up to move to Wisconsin and to eventually move out to California, where they would buy into a yacht brokerage that would thrive in the boom of the mid-2000s and fall apart in the Great Recession that ended the decade. Somewhere on the same ocean, Cole was biding his time on the Gypsy Lady, doing who knew what. Tim's boat was winterized up in Rhode Island, and he was learning how to be a father and learning what it meant to be truly tied down and truly in love. And in the British Virgin Islands, I fought the same battle with my dad that had been fought over and over again, except by now we were tired of fighting it. It was a war neither of us could win. Why are you so worried about me living with Carrie? I'm on my own now, anyway, I said. Haven't you thought about what it will look like? He's 9 years older than you are, Dad said. Age is relative, and who's looking? I'd convinced myself that age was simply a number. After all, growing up on the boat and hanging out with whatever kids came along flying the kids aboard flag, I'd had friends who were older than me and friends who were younger. Most of my friends now were in their 20s and 30s. I would keep the philosophy moving forward and tend to see people for who they were to me and not for how old they were. Carrie's immature for 28 and I'm mature for 19, I said, so it works. Just don't do it, Dad said.